Good morning, Stan Honey. We're talking to you. You are in San Francisco now, so it's your morning and it's evening in Norway. We're talking to you because you are really famous with the three disciplines in sailing. You are a world famous navigator. You won the Volvo Ocean Race. You had the round the world record with the French guys on the Groupama. You've, as we said, you won the Volvo Ocean Race in ABN Amro, and not only that, you also did the graphics and the engineering of the America's Cup in 2013 and made it a huge broadcasting success. So you are an America's Cup expert. We'll talk about that. And then, as if that was not enough, you are also one of the founders of offshore double, which is a discipline that many people hope is going to be part of the Paris 2024 Olympics. I want to talk a little bit about everything. So, talk about your career as a navigator. Tell me about how it was to sail with the French guys around the world, beating the record in the trimaran.
Well, I've actually had, two careers. I've had since college, I've had a normal career as an electrical engineer, working in defense and then working in vehicle navigation, digital mapping, tracking. And my love has been in, navigation and tracking. And so then I've had the incredible good fortune that ever since college, I've also navigated part-time professionally. And so I've had, kind of two careers running in parallel, but I've had the incredible good fortune that, everything I've done since college has been related to navigation and tracking, whether it was in defense or whether it was vehicle navigation or whether it was tracking hockey pucks or footballs or race cars or, what have you. The, the professional navigation, I've navigated professionally part-time since college, navigating on, mostly big boats. And I've had the good fortune to sail with, successful business guys, like Steve Fawcett and Roy Disney, Larry Ellison, Jim Clark, Richard Branson, and in all of, their boats. But I always did it part-time right up until 2004 when Moose Sanderson called me and asked me to navigate the ABN Amro and the Volvo. And at that point, I was just about 50. And I realized sensibly that if I said no to that Volvo, that was probably my last chance. And I was actually at a good time in my career to leave. So I left the company I had founded, SportVision, joined Moose, full-time, and then navigated in the Volvo. And I was expecting to go back into my technology career. But after the Volvo in 2005-06, more interesting sailing opportunities came up. I became navigator and performance director for Team Origin, the British America's Cup team. And then, of course, that America's Cup got complicated. And then after that, I was asked by Franck Camas to navigate Groupama 3 in the Jules Verne. And that was an incredible honor. But the first, not least of which it was an honor because I'm an American. And here, to have a French team at that level ask an American to navigate, and as you know, every French guy is a navigator because they come up through the shorthanded world. And so they all know how to navigate. And so to have the French ask me to navigate was just a huge honor. But they really wanted, I asked Franck, why would you ask an American? And his answer was interesting. He wanted somebody who would try to get it perfect, the way he knows that, Volvo navigators have to try to get it perfect because there's 9 other guys out there, in similar boats. And so that was a huge honor and tons of fun to have opportunity to sail with those guys. And then it was after that, in fact, it was while we were in the Southern Ocean that Larry Ellison and Russell Coutts sent an email saying, and this was following up on a conversation I'd had at the nav station in Sayonara with Larry Ellison 15 years earlier. But 15 years earlier, when I was developing the yellow first down line for football, Larry Ellison was curious about what I was doing, and he asked, could you do that for sailing? And I said, well, you could, but it would be expensive. And here's what you do. You put, lay lines and ladder lines on the water from the helicopter. And then 15 years later, when he won the America's Cup, Ellison remembered that and tracked me down. And that's how the Liveline project started in 2005, which, as you mentioned, was introduced in the 34th Cup in 2013.
It was a really breakthrough for transmitting sailing into the regular audience. They could understand what was going on, and the commentary was great, and the backdrop of San Francisco, of course, was great. The venue was really perfect for that type of racing.
Yeah, I've done a number of these augmented reality systems for sports in my career. The first down line, tracking baseballs, hockey pucks, race cars, and all of those systems, the systems that work best are systems where you take something that's really important to the sport but hard to see, and then you make it easy to see. And the thing about sailing is that sailing had the most to gain, because just looking at two triangles on a blue background, it's really hard for people to understand the sport. And it's even hard for sailors to understand it, because it's not really obvious where the wind direction is. And the photographers are always trying to get the bows to line up, and they can get the bows to line up no matter what the wind direction is. And so it's really hard even for sailors. But as soon as you put the ladder lines down and the lay lines down, then you can understand, at a glance, and suddenly you see the game. And the thing that absolutely fascinated all of us was how effective the ladder lines were, those 100-meter lines, because it makes it look like a football pitch. And everybody, not even the non-sailors, immediately get it. Oh, I see. The further down the field you are, the better off you are. And then the fact that boats can't go straight down the field, the fact that they have to tack or jibe, people don't get troubled by. They just get it. It's really interesting how easy that made sailing to understand for non-sailors. So we were all delighted to see how well that worked.
Do you think that America's Cup, taking the transition from monohulls 12 meters International America's Cup class into today's 75-foot foiling boats, do you think that has improved the America's Cup? Is it making match racing better? What do you think about it?
It's made it different. Some things are better. The speed and the technology. So it's more like F1, where you're just a fan of the technology itself and a fan of the intrigue associated with the technology, who's going to get it right and who isn't. And the differences are much more evident, I think, than they used to be between, the subtle differences between, 12s or IACC boats. I do miss, as an old guy, I do miss the sailors running around, changing sails, jibing, and I miss the seamanship of, watching a really windy race where some of the boats are getting in trouble and others of the crew or other crews are, handling it well. So I miss the seamanship and the obvious, sailing. But I can't say it's better or worse. It's just different. We've sort of traded off. We no longer see sailors sailing, hoisting and dousing spinnakers and jibing poles and stuff. But we do see kind of this F1 level of technology and, competing based on the technology and the engineering. So it's different. And then the match racing, there's some incredible races where there have been very evident match racing, like the one on the 22nd, where there was, 9 lean changes. But then there's other races where, once the boat gets ahead, if it's, unless it's hugely shifty, it's really hard for anybody else to have, to get back ahead. And so there's other races where I think it has been boring, but I guess you could say that was true in the old days as well. So I guess to long-winded answer to your question, it's different. And so I miss some of the old parts, but certainly some of the new parts are fascinating.
But even though you are not involved in the technology on broadcasting the regatta, you are still involved in the America's Cup.
Yeah, the last the 34th Cup, I led the development of live line and of the electronic umpiring and of the electronic race management and some of the systems to find, sailors who were, potentially trapped underwater. Then in the 35th Cup, that technology group was led by Mark Sheffield, but I helped operate the system, for the final cup. And then this cup, my involvement is completely different. This cup, I'm on the rules committee with Carlos de Beltran and Hasso Hofmeister. Mm. And we all, the three of us, work from our homes, and we're in charge of doing rules interpretations as they come up.
Have you been busy during this America's Cup?
Yes, far busier than I could have imagined.
Yes. We see that there are three different teams, other than the Defender. We haven't seen the Defender really very much yet, but we have seen three different teams. How will you describe these teams? I mean, you have an American team that was very unfortunate, and also the Italian and the British team. How will you describe these three teams? Briefly.
I think the American team, it seemed like they had incredible technical potential. Their boat seemed difficult to sail. Watching, the sailors struggle with it, but the boat seemed to have incredible potential. Then they had that, incredible bad luck at that mark rounding and damaged the boat. And then it was an extraordinary accomplishment that they got the boat back out on the water. But having lost all that time, I think it was no surprise that they, weren't able to recover entirely, from that setback. So I think that was just a, horrible bad luck for them. But I think the boat had great potential. The Ineos boat, I think, has been a tick off the pace, but they've done extraordinarily well just because they've sailed it so well. And that was I think it was very impressive to watch, how well Ben and Giles and the rest of the crew, were sailing that boat. And then I think the Luna Rossa team, they've just been improving across the board. They're sailing better and better, and they're getting the boat better and better. And the combination of those improvements in their sailing and in the boat, has ended up with a, it ended up with an unbeatable package, up until we'll have to see what happens when they run across the Kiwis.
Mm. There are three different boats, and when you look at them, they're quite different. The engineering is very much the same because they are still lifting and sailing on one foil, which I think is incredible to watch. And even if there are different boats, the speed difference is very small. I mean, maybe it's half a knot or even less, but it makes a big difference on the race course like this. But also the sailors. I mean, in all fairness to the American team, I mean, Dean Barker and Hutchinson, they are very good sailors, but it's pretty tough against people like Ben Ainsley and Jimmy Spitting, don't you think?
Yeah, I mean, all those guys are an incredibly skilled level of the support of the sport. So it's hard to pick between them. But I do think that Keiko and Jimmy have ended up with a way of working together that's, extremely effective. And it was, I think, we saw them struggle a little bit in the early stages to sort out the sharing of the responsibility. But at the end of the day, I think they've ended up with an approach that's, hugely effective. And I think their boat has been, we've seen improvements, across time with their boat. So that's made them into a very tough package.
Because there was very little time for the America's Cup World Series that was supposed to have started last year. So the learning curve was pretty steep when they started before Christmas, and it turned out very different than what we had expected in that pre-Christmas regatta. And that was because the learning curve was so steep, and it was achieved differently by the different teams.
Yeah, I think, commercially, that's of course a huge setback for a lot of the sponsors and organizations involved and the teams to have missed the World Series. But for the rest of us, it almost made it more interesting because you've seen this learning curve, compressed into such a short time under such pressure. For the sailors to figure out how to sail it, and they always do. I mean, they always figure it out. And the engineers to, figure out what techniques and what changes in the boats they can do. So it's really been extraordinary to watch, those improvements in technique and in boats over such a short period of time. So yeah, losing the World Series, I'm sure, was a disaster commercially, but for the rest of us, I think it was great because we got to see a much more interesting sequence of racing.
Do you think that the challengers have had an advantage compared to the defender in the fact that they've had these tune-up races with the Product Cup, and they've been matching against each other for a long period of time, whereas New Zealand had to practice on their own?
I couldn't call that. It's interesting, and it's even interesting that the teams themselves sometimes change their mind on that. Where I think Jimmy has admitted that he would have preferred to have gone straight into the finals and had that time for development, but having had to race, they got a lot out of it. So I don't think anybody really knows what's going to make the bigger difference, the development time or the racing experience.
Perhaps in the start, it would have made a difference because you have had the chance to sharpen your starting practices when you are up against a competitor in many races.
Yeah, and I suppose you could also at least make the hypothesis that one of the things that seems incredibly important at the start is the ability to predict, time to burn, prior to the last maneuver. So, with the tack or with the jibe, how much time do we have, to burn to the line? And that's the sort of thing that, you learn from racing, but you also, if you really want to develop that quickly, you just do a ton of practice starts and get your tool dialed in. But it does seem like that's a really important element of the pattern that has emerged the way they often start, is that it's a big advantage if the boat really has the best prediction of time to burn with a tack or a jibe, to the start.
On the other hand, the defender has a challenge, has the advantage of developing the rule before anybody else. That could also.
Yep, I think that's right. They have some advanced insight into the rule, the challenger and defender.
So do you think that Italy could win the America's Cup?
Say again?
Do you think that Italy could win the America's Cup?
Oh, absolutely. I think it'll be a very interesting race to see.
I think you're right. We have to hope. It's only a week away, and it's going to be very, very interesting. Now let's talk about your third involvement in sailing, and that is you were one of the founders of Offshore Double, which is now ultimately going for the Paris Olympics 2024. Tell me about this involvement on your part and why you think it's so important.
Well, for the last 6 years, I was the chairman of the World Sailing Oceanic and Offshore Committee with Matt Allen as my vice chairman. And it was during that period that, a number of us, including my committee, sort of defined, kind of penciled out and then proposed the offshore mixed double event for the Olympics. And that had a variety of false starts, but at the end of the day, it did get accepted, and as part of the slate. Matt will be the chair of Oceanic and Offshore going forward. So we've transitioned, and I'm now on council for Group P. So I'll obviously continue to be involved at World Sailing. But during the process of having had that offshore doubles mixed gender event be part of the slate, we realized that in the world sailing community, there was a missing piece, meaning because we're structured it so that it's focused around a discipline of double-handed offshore sailing, and it's not focused around a single piece of equipment, meaning we haven't just picked a class, and we're not calling the event the name of the class. Because it's discipline based, we realized there was really a missing piece. We didn't have a class organization to represent this event alongside all the other class organizations. So what we did was we created a discipline organization, which is the Offshore Doubles Association. And we convinced Larry Rosenfeld to be the executive director of it. Matt and I helped finance it to get it off the ground. And then it stunned all of us that, Larry brought it into being, but within just a couple months, it grew to be 1,600 members in, I think, 66 countries around the world. So it really grew like crazy. And then when they started to count events, it very quickly got up to, I think, 100, double-handed events of, varying lengths and structures around the world. So it really, that organization did a remarkable job of uncovering the fact that this really is a fast-growing discipline. And it was a fast-growing discipline even before COVID. But I think the COVID virus, added some fuel to the fire, so to speak, because it's easier to sail with a smaller crew, in the era of the virus. But I think, Matt Allen has observed that in Sydney Harbor, you can sail in a double-handed event, 6 days of the week. And I know in San Francisco Bay, my wife and I have been sailing our boat. Well, we sailed 505s for 20 years, and of course that was double-handed. But since we gave up 505s and got too old, we've been sailing our 40-footer double-handed ever since 1990. And there are double-handed offshore races in San Francisco Bay, every other week, all through the sailing season. And so the double-handed racing in San Francisco Bay includes the most popular events of the year, with the best attendance. So this really has been a growing discipline. But I think the Offshore Doubles Association really helped to make that obvious.
How important is it to be a part of the Olympic Games, you think?
I don't think it's that important for the offshore double-handed discipline. I think the offshore double-handed discipline has been growing for the last few decades, and I think it'll continue to grow because it just makes sense. It's far more fun and engaging to be racing offshore double-handed because you're engaged all the time. You're never just sitting on the rail. So I think it's a fabulous part of our sport. So I don't think it's important for offshore double-handed racing to be in the Olympics, but I think it's far more important than a lot of people realize for the sport of sailing to have offshore double-handed sailing in the Olympics, because I think that event has the ability to put sailing on the map in terms of being a media sport. And I think that can raise a question, do any of us care? Should it matter, whether we're a media sport or not? And from the kind of sailing that all of us do individually, for recreation, it probably doesn't matter. But if we're going to be an Olympic sport, then the sport really needs to be viable. And I think sports do get measured for their value to the Olympics in terms of how interesting they are. And the problem that sailing has is that sailing is really interesting to sailors. The stories about, is that a persistent shift, or is that an oscillating shift, or did that boat have an overlap before the zone entry? I mean, we get all that and we love that stuff, but that's of no interest, to most sports fans. Whereas the thing about the offshore event is it will be the longest endurance event in the entire Olympic Games. And the story won't be about esoteric aspects of sailing. The story will be about human response to an incredibly stressful situation. So you'll have these two people, and in a 3 or 4 day endurance event, the longest endurance event of the whole Olympics, they have to decide, how much rest are they going to get and how hard are they going to sail. And they have enormously difficult decisions to make tactically. They're under a lot of, competitive, performance pressure. And there will be teams that make the mistake of, trying too hard, not getting enough sleep, making a mistake late in the race. And you'll see that incredible human drama of having them have a medal slip away from them because they can't keep their heads screwed on straight because they're too tired. And I've had, as you know from our previous conversation, I've worked a lot of my career in professional sports. And I've gotten to know and develop systems for some of the best, producers in all of professional sports, in particular, David Hill and Jeffrey Mason, Jed Drake. These guys are known as the fathers of the modern sports broadcast. And I worked for them in baseball, football, motorsports. And these guys have all given me grief through the years saying, nobody cares about sailing. When I say about, why don't we have more sailing on TV? Their answer is, Stan, nobody cares, get over it. But when they heard about this double-handed event, they called me up and they said, we'd love to be involved because this isn't about sailing. This is about, human response to an incredibly stressful situation. And this will be the most interesting story of the entire Summer Olympics, because of the endurance and because it's about the human response to stress. And so I think sailing needs this event, because this event can put sailing on the map in terms of making sailing visible as the incredible sport that it is. We have races that go for 80 days. And I think to the extent that sailing wants to be a commercially viable sport, and we want to be, in the Olympics for the long term, I think it makes sense to help make visible to sports fans who aren't sailors the riveting nature of our sport in terms of these other events like offshore sailing.
You're probably right. Shorthanded sailing is growing, and it makes a lot of sense in every respect that this is the future of ocean racing, or part of ocean racing, and also coastal racing. I think it is much easier to get a crew together, and it's cheaper. It has a lot of challenges. But to have it as an Olympic Games in Paris in 2024, first you have to select a class, which is going to be difficult. And that class is going to be announced on the 31st of December 2023. And then people will buy boats and practice before the games. People will get their boats at different times. It's going to be expensive. I think only the very rich countries can afford to buy these boats if they're not provided by the Olympic organization. And then you have the question of security. We have a lot of sailboats out in the Mediterranean. We all remember Munich 1972. The worst thing that would happen would be that there would be some terrorist attack on some of the sailboats in the Mediterranean. I'm not going to, paint the devil on the wall, but it's a challenge.
Well, let's take those one at a time.
Yep.
The first thing you look at is what we've done to try to make this about a discipline rather than a class. The easy approach to have taken would have been to pick a boat, and then the teams go off and buy those boats, and the larger countries with more money to spend would buy a fleet of the boats and set up a training camp. The result of that would have been what happened to the women's match racing, that the wealthy countries buy fleets of boats and set up training camps, and the smaller countries look at that and they say, well, this is a fool's errand and it's not worth us even trying. And so that event only ran once because the little countries thought that it was a fool's errand for them. So how can we avoid that? Well, the way that we're trying to avoid that is by having this be about the discipline of offshore racing, not about any one class. And then you look at the criteria of boats that we've selected. That criteria doesn't describe an extreme offshore racer. It doesn't describe a foiling, canting, extreme boat. It describes a very middle of the road, conventional, fixed keel, asymmetric rigged, monohull, with no foils. And there's, I think, listed on the website, there's 12 examples of that. And frankly, all of those boats are very similar, meaning if you saw them all tied up at a dock, if they didn't have the mainsail up and you couldn't see the logo, you'd struggle to, recognize which was which. They're all, similar. So the idea is that the sailors conclude that because they don't know what the equipment is until, fairly late in the process, that the best thing they can do to train is just spend a ton of nights offshore racing. And this is going to be, we call it an offshore race, but it's going to be a coastal race, along the coast, the Mediterranean coast of France. And we know how challenging it is along that coast in particular, that, every day you're going to have wind transitions between the nighttime drainage breeze and the morning sea breeze and the afternoon synoptic breeze. And the sailors that know how to deal with those transitions, that know what it means at night when suddenly it smells like grass, or they know what it means at night when the dew dries off the deck, or they know what it means in the morning when there's no more vertical twist to the wind. And the way to learn those techniques is to spend tons and tons of time offshore. And so I've had, sailors call me up, say, hey, what do? I don't know what the kind of boat is. And the answer is, well, look at what the criteria of the boat is. Find a boat that fits that criteria and borrow it. And you can often borrow the boat by, going to the local marina, finding the perfect boat, and then making a deal with the owner, saying, we'd like to use your boat to train for the Olympics, and if you want to race in the weekend, we'll crew for you. And so you get, a crew of Olympians on the weekends. Meanwhile, we get to race, to train on the boat the rest of the time. But I do think, especially for this small country, if they had, a couple of sailors who wanted to train for this event, they can find a boat in the local marina that fits the category. But if they spend, 150 nights offshore, they've got a good shot at the event, because I don't think this event, like a lot of offshore racing, I don't think it's going to get won like a Volvo does, where you're, a hundredth of a knot faster on a reach. And you just spend day after day after day after day, reaching up and down the Atlantic. I don't think that's what's going to determine this. I think what's going to determine this is somebody making the call correctly on the transition because they're a better seaman. And I think that is the skill to really go after. So I think as it happens, for a small country and for a crew, this could in fact be the cheapest event, because these boats exist. There's tens of thousands of them around the world, that boats that fit this criteria. They can be borrowed and used, and trained in. You don't need to bring your own boat to the Olympic Games. It's supplied equipment, at the Games. And even the equipment at the Olympic Games, these are boats that are going to meet OSR Category 2. So these are going to be strong, seaworthy boats that are going to have a long life, after the Olympics. And one can even argue, for the boat manufacturer that supplies the fleet for the Olympic Games, one could even argue that the fleet of boats that get used for the Olympics is going to be worth more after the Games than it was worth before the Games, because of the paint job or just the prestige of having been used in the Olympics and gotten dialed in by Olympians. So I think, it is interesting that the event gets criticized for being expensive. And I'll admit, it does look expensive. These boats are expensive, and you see these big boats out in the water and it looks like an expensive event. But, for a small country, it may actually be the cheapest event, because it's not cheap to have two NACRAs, and at the end of the Olympics you don't have much. You've kind of used them up. Whereas for an event like this, I think if you had a couple of sailors in a smaller country, this could actually be the most attractive and the most affordable event to take a run at. The safety issue is also
Just
interesting.
one more thing regarding these boats. Do we know that they are being financed and being provided for free to the Olympians?
For the Olympic Games, yes. So that there will be a fleet that's provided at the Olympic Games, and then the teams will show up and they'll probably have a drawing, for their boat, a week or two before the race. And then there'll be, as with all offshore sailing, there'll be no redress. So the teams will have to, get their boat. The boats will all be equalized. The teams will have a week or so to get familiar with their boat and to inspect their boat for any latent defects. And then during the race, they got to take care of their boat, because if they break it, they can't win.
How do they qualify?
The qualification scheme is still being discussed, but one of the proposals is that, let's assume that there's, 18 boats in the finals, and even that hasn't been nailed down. But assuming there's 8, you could have, in The Hague, you could qualify for 9, and then you have the French that get a bye. You probably have a last chance regatta at the scene of the Olympic Games where another team can get in. And then you'd have the 6 continental qualifiers. So for each of the, Olympic continents as defined for world sailing, there'd be a qualifier there. So then the small countries, again, it would look pretty reasonable to them, because they would look at it and think, okay, if 9 boats are going to qualify at The Hague, and that happens first, that'll probably take care of a lot of the powerhouse countries in offshore sailing. So the French are already in, but Great Britain, Australia, New Zealand, I'd love to say US was a powerhouse, but nevertheless, a bunch of those countries will qualify at The Hague. And so then for the continental qualifiers, that's pretty darn attractive to the small countries.
When you talk about The Hague, that's because Hague is the host of the World Sailing Regatta 2 years before.
Right. And then at The Hague, because The Hague, the regatta runs over a long period of time, and our race is just 3 days, you could have multiple heats. So you could structure The Hague to say any country that wants to show up can show up and have a go, and then you have multiple heats, and then the winners of those heats all race in the finals, and then the top 9 boats of the finals are qualified. But again, I'm describing this as if it has been decided. It hasn't. This is just one of the proposals that has been kicked around, and it's a proposal that I think is pretty attractive, because it deals with the fact that everything is late because of the virus, but it deals with that fact in a fairly clean-cut way to say, okay, well, now qualifying is simpler. We're going to have The Hague, and we're going to have 6 continental qualifiers, and then we're going to have the French and a last-minute boat to get in. And so it's kind of easy to understand. And from the standpoint of the small countries, which are critical, I think it's pretty attractive for the small countries, to think of qualification, using an approach somewhat like that.
And then it's going to be 18 boats in the Olympics itself?
I'm just guessing. That hasn't been determined, but I'm based on discussions that I've seen kicked around, I would hope that it ends up, close to that.
Okay, sorry to interrupt. Now you're going to talk about the security.
Safety. So there's 2 parts of safety. There's sailor safety, and then there's field of play safety. The sailor safety, I think we can knock that one out of the ballpark, given the experience of our sport. But the first thing we're doing is, in part, to make sure that these boats are valuable. We're making sure that the boats meet OSR Category 2. So that means that these are very capable boats that are being, capable of, doing ocean races. And so the boats will be, very capable of doing a 3-day race in the Mediterranean coast of France in the summer. But the reason we're doing OSR Category 2 Yeah, it makes the boats a little more expensive, but it makes the boat hold their value and be much more valuable, for a longer period of time because they are capable boats. So that's why we're doing that. But if you take that, the fact that these are going to be such, strong seaworthy boats, and then you couple that with the expertise and the tradition of our sport, where we, sailors save each other lives even in the Southern Ocean, in much more difficult conditions, as evidenced by the Vendée Globe, I think we're in great shape in terms of sailor security. And that's not even counting on the fact that this fleet will no doubt be escorted. So sailor security, I think we're in great shape just because of the seamanship at that level of our sport and because of the capabilities of the equipment and the proven nature of the equipment. And then field to play safety is interesting. The first thing that's happened recently is the French Navy has stepped up to the plate and said, we got that. We'll take care of field to play security. We can look after 18 boats floating around in the Med, no problem. So that's that's a critical element of it. Having been to, hundreds of sporting events, over my career, I would observe that there's some advantages to, looking after field to play security for, 18 boats out on the ocean relative to, marathon runners that are running along a track where there's hundreds of thousands of spectators right next to the track, or a stadium with 50,000 people in the stadium. I mean, all of these things have very different security challenges. But there's some security people that will tell you that looking after 18 boats out on the ocean is easier because you can see what's around them, and you can keep open space around them. But in any event, nobody doubts the French Navy's ability to look after that, and the French Navy has stepped up to the plate and said that they'll take care of it, and they'll do so at no charge.
Mm-hmm. Great. I think that we have a lot of things to look forward to. Now it's the America's Cup, and then it's the Tokyo Olympics, I hope. We will know for sure. I know that the IOC president had a press conference today. I missed that because I've been talking to you, but I don't know what he had to say. I hope he didn't cancel the Olympic Games. And in any event, it's really been a great pleasure to talk to you. You cover really the entirety of the sport, and we could talk for hours. I could listen to you. It would be extremely enlightening, but we have to end. So thank you very much for your time.
Well, thank you. This has been a pleasure, and it's fun to chat about such insightful questions. Thank you.